You've probably seen or at least heard of the movie Minority Report. In that movie, famously, there are these things, these kinds of people called precogs who can predict when someone is going to commit a crime. And in that movie, when the precogs sense or know or whatever it is that someone is going to commit a crime, the helicopters come around, the SWAT team comes in, and they stop that person from committing the crime before they ever commit it and arrest them and punish them, so on and so forth. It's a real nightmare vision, right? It's a kind of, not quite surveillance, but there's a punishment of people for committing crimes that they would have committed, but they did not because the precogs saw it happening and the police intervened. It's not a picture of the future that anybody would want. Now, of course, we don't have precogs, but we do have AI and AI in the criminal justice system and AI making certain kinds of predictions about how humans are going to behave. And so it's natural, one might think, to fear that something like the Minority Report vision is coming to real life insofar as AI is getting integrated into the criminal justice system. Now, there's sort of, broadly speaking, two moves you can make here. One move is to say, no, we can't allow any of this in any way, shape, or form. One reason is that in order for AI to do this kind of thing, the company's government would have to gather so much data about us that there would be a massive invasion of our privacy. It's a surveillance state in that way. And so we must put a stop to it now. The Minority Report vision is appalling. And so we need to stop it at the source, which is make sure that that kind of data that's required in order to make those kinds of predictions isn't accessible to government and corporations. There's an alternative, though, and this is what my guest Guha, professor of law and longtime friend, has to say. Look, I hope that those privacy advocates and activists win the day. That's probably the way things would be best. But Guha's a bit of, one might call him a realist, one might call him a pessimist, and he thinks, look, that sort of Luddite vision of AI in the criminal justice system is, while appealing in many respects, it's just not going to happen. So this is an empirical claim. It's not an ethical or a normative claim that it ought not to. It's just, this is the way things are going to unfold. As you know, it's not going to be possible that the criminal justice system is insulated from the impacts of this evolving and powerful technology that is AI. Given that, now what? And what Guha says, at the core of it anyway, is that there is the Minority Report vision, and what we need is the articulation of another kind of vision of what the criminal justice system might look like when predictive AI is employed. So it's not, you cannot collect this data, you cannot make these kinds of predictions. It's sort of, to some extent, conceding defeat, and then saying, what do we do about that now? That's the core of it. So I'm not going to say more about Guha's vision and what he thinks we really ought to do. He'll articulate that. But that's the really big picture thing to keep in mind, that we're not going to get to stop with the collection of all that data. The Minority Report vision is a really horrible one, and so we need a different one in order to fund how we think about the criminal justice system with AI in a way that's not morally abhorrent and even downright beneficial, at least potentially. Okay, that's everything I have to say by way of intro. Usual housekeeping stuff. If you like this podcast, and presumably you do, you're listening to it right now, so clearly you like it, right? Why don't you go review it, give it 5 stars, tell your friends about it, that sort of thing. And if you have any recommendations on who you'd like me to talk to or issues you'd like me to address, please email me at em, as in ethical machines, em@reedblackman.com. All right, thanks so much as always, and let's go talk to Guha. It's not uncommon for me to get questions about AI and criminal justice, and in particular, people are usually really worried about things like bias in the system. So they'll talk about things like biased facial recognition software being used to identify people who, suspects, and then the wrong person gets arrested. It's often a black man who gets arrested, even though it was a false identification by the software. And so people get really worked up about bias in AI in the criminal justice system. Are there other kinds of things that people are worried about?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think you're right that, from my vantage point, a lot of scholarship that is confronting the use of algorithmic methods and AI in criminal justice are worried about error. But there's another kind of thing that people seem to be worried about, and that is, what if it is too good? What if things, AI and algorithms predict criminal wrongdoing really, really well, and then are deployed by law enforcement and in a way that is ubiquitous, thus taking away our freedom, right? I think this is another kind of big concern.
So it's like you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. So something like that. You use AI and it's going to go sideways. Either it's going to be sort of generic error, just it gets it wrong, or it's going to be error of a particular variety where it's incorrect and discriminatory. That's when AI doesn't work well. And then the alternative is it works really well, and then we've got minority report concerns, like we have pre-crime.
That's exactly right. And, so a lot of the discourse about, integrating algorithms and AI into criminal justice is, the minority report vision, right? That's just going to go down, and we're going to have minority report, we're going to have pre-crime, and you're going to have stormtroopers on every block arresting people
right.
and punishing them before they've actually even done anything.
Yeah. So, okay. I mean, I know that this is not your answer, but the sort of naive response to this is, maybe it's not naive. I think this is actually, I think it's both common and maybe it's also naive. Let's just not use AI in criminal justice. The stakes are too high. We're talking about whether people get imprisoned or not. In some cases, maybe even executed or not. We're talking about their careers, their livelihoods, their family well-being, etc. It's way too high stakes. Either it's going to get it wrong in a variety of ways, or it's going to get it too right. It's no good. So let's just not use AI in the criminal justice system at all. Look, you want to do some minor paperwork with it? Okay, fine. But for anything of real substance, it should just not be used.
Yeah, I think that, this has come to be, that sort of Luddite vision is come to dominate some, discussions by both progressives, of which I count myself as one, and civil libertarians, again, I count myself as one, in criminal justice. And I think that this is a misguided response. Now, I don't think it's a misguided response because I am some huge believer in AI and algorithms. It's because we know the way, and your podcast is really devoted to the direction that this is going. We are not going to be able to stop this juggernaut. It's going to infect every part of our lives. And the notion that we would have a criminal justice exceptionalism for algorithmic methods and AI, I just think is Pollyannish. That's really not going to happen.
So, I mean, you might even concede, maybe you don't, you might concede, that would be great if we could just make sure that AI doesn't work its way into the criminal justice system in any significant way. But that's not plausible. Given the implausibility of that, we're just going to have to deal with it. And then the question becomes, what's the appropriate way to deal with it, as opposed to just screaming, no, never, not here.
Yeah. So one thing is, I probably wouldn't even make that concession. I think you're right that I'm, for the purposes of, what I'm thinking about right now, maybe happy to make that concession and say, look, we're going to have to live with this. But, what I think, has come out through lots of scholarship is that if we use some of these algorithmic methods, to their full advantage, we can drastically reduce sentences and police intrusion into our lives. And so I think there's also actually quite a bit of promise there. And so this idea that I have in mind really wants to marshal some of the promise of algorithmic methods, but really center the notion that these things can benefit our lives. It's not just a juggernaut that's going to storm over us. These algorithmic methods can be used in ways that benefit us, and that we have to center and focus that.
So give me some of these things, what are the examples where AI is going to be potentially useful in the criminal justice system?
Yeah, so I want to think about two examples. One that has to do with what we might think a very formalistic or a minor transgression. And one, let's think about a more serious transgression. So that's jaywalking at one end of the spectrum and homicide, murder, violent crime on the other side.
Sure.
So, I think under the minority report vision of how AI would get integrated into criminal law. The idea is, we would use these methods to predict when somebody is going to jaywalk, and then we deploy a force of officers, and they're going to grab you before, and they're going to throw you into, a police wagon and give you a day detention or something like that.
Be very busy in New York.
Yeah, you'd be extremely busy in New York, and this is why people are fearful. It's like, hey, this is part of my general life. Am I going to just get pulled over whenever? And the other way we could think about this is, no, we could use AI to, be integrated with your phone. People look in their phones anyways when they're crossing the street, to tell you when you could efficiently cross. It would track, vehicular movement, and it would say, look, you can cross in a more efficient way. You don't have to go to the crosswalk. You can cross across the street right now in a way that's safe and poses no danger. And that's actually kind of liberating, right? And it would tell you, hey, it's actually dangerous to cross right now. Don't, right? And at the same time, it would tell vehicles like, hey, there's a pedestrian that looks like they're sort of rejecting our advice on this. Slow down and don't run into them, right? And in this way, we actually enable people to do the thing they wanted to do, which is cross at their whim, in a way that's safer and more efficient. And we don't involve the criminal justice system at all. We're not pulling people over. We're not nabbing them before they do any of this because, jaywalking is, there's nothing in itself that's wrongful about jaywalking.
Yeah. Okay. I get that. That's a potentially interesting example. I mean, I don't know exactly how you'd build such a platform. It seems like require a lot of coordination among a lot of entities, but okay.
Well, just say, yes, of course it's going to take coordination. It's going to take lots of effort. But the sort of predominant assumption here is if you're going to be able to predict people's criminal wrongdoing, you're going to have to tap into lots and lots of data. You're going to have to know lots of stuff about them to do this at any level of precision under this sort of Minority Report vision. Otherwise, you're not going to get good predictions. So the governing assumption here is that we have a life that is going to be dominated by AI and algorithmic prediction in sort of all walks of our life. So if you can't actually predict, whether I'm jaywalking or not, then you're not going to be able to use it. And if you can, you could probably tell me it's safe to cross here or not.
Yeah, okay. I mean, obviously we've got privacy concerns. I mean, if the criminal justice system is enabled in such a way that it can collect that much data about us, then we've got other kinds of concerns, I would think. So now I'm beginning to worry that sort of AI-enabled or AI-augmented criminal justice system entails massive violations of privacy of all the citizens that AI is working on.
Oh, I think that is probably right. Okay. And so, I would say, if we are able to create the bulwark against, this kind of privacy intrusion on us, then okay, and that's good, right? That's a good in maintaining our privacy. But if we're able to do that, we are probably going to lack the resources to get into really good criminal detection and prediction.
Yeah.
So the governing assumption here is that that's probably not going to be able to happen, right? I mean, there's just, so much of our lives are really just public, and, they're public, and it's just, we have so much information about us that is just publicly available. And I think that the sort of concern about the Minority Report vision is that stuff is going to get marshaled, and there aren't adequate constitutional or legal protections against the government using that information.
Okay. Go to the other extreme now.
So homicide, violent crime, grave kinds of crimes that cause, serious harms. The notion there is that, if you're able to predict that somebody is going to engage in that, the Minority Report vision is, of course, we would just go and apprehend them and then put them in prison for a long period of time, right? Because they're inherently dangerous.
Which people find morally abhorrent, since now you're arresting and imprisoning people for something they've not done.
Yes, right. Now, one thing I have to note is that a lot of our punishment is already based on things that you haven't done yet. right? So
thinking of like intent to murder, is that the idea?
No, it's that when you are sentenced, you are often sentenced principally, this is like a very important factor, on whether you are going to commit wrongs in the future.
Oh, that's interesting. I haven't thought about sentencing much, but I think that it was a function of how bad was the thing that was done. You're saying it's more it's forwards looking. What's the probability you're going to do something like this again?
It's multifactorial, right? There are multiple variables. Of course, the graveness of the conduct that you have committed does figure in. But if it were the case, you take two, comparators, two individuals, both of them have committed an equally grave crime. One has a higher chance of committing the crime in the future.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I suppose like if they did it under extenuating circumstances, they were under duress, they were under an unusual amount of stress because their parents just died in a car crash, whatever. Right?
Whatever it is.
Right. And so you might think they're less likely and still give them a lighter sentence.
Yeah, exactly. They would get they would often get a lesser sentence. Another kind of example is people of different ages. So, there's pretty good data that people at, older ages, their proclivity for criminal wrongdoing goes down. And so they might be sentenced lower because they're sort of older and have less chance of committing further crime. So the system already takes into account things that you have not done. So this is not foreign to our system.
You might say something like, okay, so that's the way the system is already, so we may as well keep doing it. I don't want to get sort of off onto a whole conversation about the ethics of sentencing.
Yeah.
But I suppose, I'm beginning to wonder, like, how could we possibly make those predictions with any reliability? How do we test to see if we're any good at them? It'd be really hard to test that. I mean, if we said someone's going to commit a crime and then they go and do it, great. If we say that, but we're not going to know because we said they're going to commit a crime, they're highly likely, so we imprison them. For all we know, they would not have, in fact. So it's hard to test that prediction. And then I'm worried about other kinds of predictors being problematic in other kinds of ways. So obviously, oh my God, there's so many issues here. Like, you might think that if you take being arrested as a proxy for likelihood to commit a crime, and you say black people are more likely to commit a crime by virtue of black people being arrested at higher rates, but really that's because they're policed at higher rates, even though they commit crimes at equal rates, use those as proxies, but you don't realize that, and then you wind up thinking that being black is a good predictor for committing a crime or at least likely to be arrested. But that doesn't mean that you should use that in consideration. Then that sort of worry just spreads to, should we really be using sort of, on what grounds do you use a predictor justifiably for sentencing?
Deep concerns that sentencing theorists, including me, are always raising. Like, are you guys using the right data in doing these predictions? But the only thing I can really say is that given how prominent the chance of, commission of a future crime is in our current sentencing regime, I just think it's going to be part of our sentencing regimes into the future.
Fair point. Yeah.
If algorithmic prediction of criminal wrongdoing does stand up to the tests, to the rigors, it's going to be used in that way too. It's going to be used prior to commission. I mean, I know that there are constitutional protections against that right now, but the Constitution is set in stone, right? Like a lot of those will knuckle under. A lot of those protections will knuckle under depending on how good we are at criminal wrongdoing prediction.
Okay, so I guess your response is something like, it might be the case that we ought not to use these various predictors in our sentencing, but we're gonna. So again, given that we're gonna, whether we use AI in this context, the relevant benchmark is, the relevant point of comparison is not AI versus newly revised methods of sentencing that humans do where they don't use these predictors. That's not on the menu. So the relevant benchmark is, how is it doing relative to humans? And then this goes to your colleague and friend point, Peter Salib, which is, we're really shitty at it. And at least with an AI, we can poke more as to determining, hey, what was this prediction based on? What were the determining factors? And then we can actually look to see, one, if something is explicitly, let's say, racist, or if something is a proxy for race, whereas we can't really do that with people.
I think that's right. I have to say, the sort of, what I am taking as a given is that we are sort of inexorably moving towards full integration of AI and algorithmic prediction in not just the criminal justice system, but other parts of our life. How do I feel about that? It really depends on the moment, right? Sometimes I'm extremely frightened by that. Sometimes I think that there's like, great promise to this, but that's like sort of the given. And then all I would say is that like, we need another vision for how this is going to get integrated into our system. Right now, Minority Report is what's dominating what it's going to look like. And there's another way. And this is where I think this issue with serious crime comes in. Look, right now, the vision is we would arrest that person and incarcerate them. We could do something else though, right? What we could do is we could deploy a team, some law enforcement individuals, a social worker, a therapist, to that individual who is, predicted to commit a violent crime. We can stop them in their tracks and say, don't do this. And perhaps, stop a lot of criminal wrongdoing without punishment, right? Punishment is the intentional imposition of harm on someone. So,
Sure.
we don't have to do that part. And then we're in a much better place. And so that's the vision that I have in mind for how we would integrate algorithms and AI into the criminal justice system.
People have said this about policing generally, right? That, in some cases or in many cases, police are put into positions for which they were not trained. Like, go deal with that homeless person. And the police are trained to arrest and, take to jail or whatever, take to the station. But the more appropriate response for a homeless person is not, or the more appropriate person to engage with that person is not a police officer, but a social worker or something along those lines who can get them the help that they need and et cetera, et cetera. I take it your point is AI agnostic, really. Your point, I think, is something like there's a vision of what, I don't know, dealing with, well, no, that's not true because let's stipulate the homeless person is not committing any kind of crime. You're saying even when it's predicting that they will commit a crime, nonetheless, the intervention is not, I don't know, militaristic, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like the point is, and, you mentioned Peter Salib, when I was talking to him about this, he sort of made this point, and I think it's pretty eloquent. One objection, right, to Minority Report is not that it predicts crime or that people come and try and stop you when you commit the crime. It's that they punish you regardless, right? If you could predict it and stop people, why punish them? Just keep doing it every time they are going to commit a wrong, I mean, I will say like right now, my car, when I'm like on my commute, alerts me when I'm going over the speed limit, tells me not to take this turn because, there's it's no right on red. And it's annoying, but it's also great because then I don't get a ticket and I don't get stopped by law enforcement or whatever. So, that's great.
Yeah. I mean, I guess there's a way in which this sort of conversation is going on in talking about mass shootings, right, where they sort of should have known there were signs that, Joey was going to shoot up the place. And I don't think people are calling, or at least it doesn't seem like they ought to call for arresting Joey. But maybe, I don't know. I guess I just don't know. But among other things, what they could do is send help. Therapists, social workers, whatever the appropriate, course of action is. That's not just lock them up now.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that you're exactly right. A lot of people say, couldn't we have intervened in some way? Now, the current state of our laws and the current state of our ability to predict precisely when somebody is going to commit a crime is still pretty low. So in that sense, I think some people say, couldn't we find something to arrest them for, right? The criminal code is massive. Couldn't we find something to stop them? But I think, if our levels of prediction get really, really good, then one thing is we could, stop them right when they're going to commit crimes. But there's another thing we can do, which is associated with what I just said, which is that we remove so much of the bloat of the criminal code, which is all about pretextual reasons for law enforcement to, intrude upon your life, right? Like most of you think about like the vehicular code, right? So much of that is so officers can stop you, not because you are posing a danger in traffic, but because they want to figure out what's going on in your car. Are you trafficking drugs? Do you have firearms? Like all this kind of stuff. That's what they want to know, right? And so, like so much of our criminal code is like that. Well, if we got really good at prediction, we could just lop all of that stuff off, right? And just remove it from the criminal code. Now, I don't know whether we will do that. That's a political question, but the project here is to urge us to do that.
Well, okay. So I was wondering about the urging. That was going to be my next question. So let's suppose, I mean, there's an empirical claim, but let's suppose that if the criminal justice system, whatever that looks like, obviously it's people within the justice system who have access to that data, who are authorized to have it. There's monitoring. We're assuming that there's certain kinds of safeguards put in place so that there's not an abuse of power by virtue of the collection and use of the data. So suppose we got that, that's already a tall order, but suppose we've got that. And if we have this vision where we're not just arresting people because we think they're committing a crime, but rather we're actively A, preventing the crime, and B, helping the person who's going to commit the crime in the first place, then I wonder if you think it's a kind of, I'll put this really strong and you can tell me you want to back off from it, but it's like a moral imperative to try to develop this technology in this way.
I do think it's morally imperative, right? Like, I think that if you have the two visions, right? One is, are we going to, predict that somebody's committing a crime and then lock them up? Or are we going to predict that they're going to commit a crime and then try and help them and stop them from at least that commission without imposing the harms of punishment on them? I think that's just such an obvious choice. Now, it gets tricky because, like how much more investment is one of these going to take over the other? But one thing is, I think that the large task at hand is criminal prediction, criminal wrongdoing, the prediction of criminal wrongdoing. And that part just seems like we are going to invest in regardless, right? After that, once you could do that, whether you deploy a set of police officers or a police officer, a social worker, and a therapist, that's really, not significantly different. I don't think the investment of my vision is so much more. So I think I would tentatively say I agree with moral imperative here.
Okay, so here's an argument to push back against that.
Sure.
You're talking about a surveillance state. A benevolent surveiller, because it's going to require all that data. Yep. That surveillance will undermine autonomy in a variety of ways because there's going to be the knowledge that everything about me is constantly being collected, analyzed, might be used in various ways to intervene in how I'm living my life. That might in turn cause me to make decisions that I wouldn't have otherwise, which is one of the problems with surveillance. It alters the behavior that you're surveilling in a way that undermines freedom. So now I sort of want to say, I see the sort of, the other picture, the picture that you're painting, aside from the Minority Report picture, I get it, sucks, terrible. Let's definitely not do that. The alternative picture that you're painting is like benevolent surveiller. One problem with the Minority Report stuff is that it's still surveillance of a sort. I mean, we get weird with precogs, but it's if you like malicious or militaristic or like fascist surveillors, and you want benevolent surveillors. Now, I think benevolent surveillors are better than stick surveillors, but I still got a problem with surveillors because that undermines autonomy. So if it were the case that, and maybe we're getting back now to where things are going to go, where they have to go. If it were the case that I had to choose between fascistic surveiller and benevolent surveiller, give me the benevolent one.
Yep.
But it just seems to me like the third option is, no. The Minority Report stuff is unacceptable right from the start, out of the gate. It's off the table. Benevolent stuff would be great in some respects, but it automatically requires so much data, so much surveillance, that should be thrown off too. And so we really do need a kind of ban on collecting that kind of data. Where are we, China? Where we're going to like monitor every single app that they use and where they're going and when they're thinking about crossing the street and et cetera, et cetera.
And this gets back to sort of like, what side of the bed did I wake up on, right? Like, I'm very sympathetic to the view that like this kind of surveillance is a real problem. I think, again, maybe call me a pessimist here. I just think we're going that direction. And I think it's an informed pessimism. Let me say why. Because like in my, my day job is really to study the Fourth and Fifth and Sixth Amendments, which are, supposed to be the protections that we have against the collection of this kind of data and, government surveillance. And they, as they're being interpreted right now, are just not up to the task. And so I am just really concerned that there's any way to protect as a legal matter against this. I mean, if you're saying like, look, no, that's where we should focus our efforts, I'm on board. I just, I think that's at best a coin toss. And so at least on one branch of that coin toss, which is we lose, and the government is engaging in surveillance, I do think we have to have a vision for what the surveillance is going to do for us. And it's really articulating that vision that I think is the task at hand for at least some of us,
So I think you articulated implicitly in a third vision that I want to explore, which is, I don't know what to call it. It's going to be something like the annoying car vision. The annoying car vision is, as you said, you're driving your car, you're doing your thing, and the car says like, you're going too fast, or, you're now going 13 miles per hour over the speed limit, or there's no right on red here. And, but it's up to you to take that right on red. It's more informing you, that things might go sideways here. Watch out.
Right.
And there's no connection to the police there. Not directly, right? That same system. I'd have a problem if, I have a Tesla and I've actually turned off some of the safety features because it's too neurotic for my taste. It's like too nuts. Like you can't be that neurotic in New York and drive. Like,
yeah,
you're just gonna have to make some moves. Anyway, I'd be very uncomfortable if I found out that Tesla were sending all of my driving data to the cops. Reed is speeding at this intersection at this point. We are predicting that he'll still be speeding when he gets, a mile down the road. Gear up. I would not like that one bit for a variety of reasons, including that my wife would kill me for getting a speeding ticket. Anyway, but I can see some kind of like on your local device AI, car, phone, whatever, saying, yo, you're about to break the law. Or I'm predicting you're going to break the law. It's like a legal Jiminy Cricket. And so it makes predictions about individual behaviors, but only reports those predictions to the person and then makes various recommendations like, don't take a left turn. Hey, call this phone number to talk to a therapist right now. Or, here's the suicide hotline or whatever it is. And so then all the prediction is not, it's for individuals to enhance their decision-making abilities, hopefully to engage in a kind of intervention, like a fitness app that says, yo, you haven't met your step goals. But that's compatible with a complete ban on using any of that predictive information in the criminal justice system.
Good. So here's one question for you, right? What if I told you, right, like my vision is to get rid of all of the unnecessary surplus of the criminal code that isn't necessary to, protecting life, like protecting really important interests. Okay, so then my criminal code looks like, and I'm going to have your annoying assistant, integrated with this code. And what it's going to do is it's going to tell you, don't turn there because you're going to run over somebody. Don't turn there because you're going to hit somebody.
Sure.
It's like really serious stuff. Okay. Now, do you still have the objection that Tesla is sharing the data with the police when all of the, commands were really serious ones? They weren't Reed was going 7 miles over. They were Reed turned, not Reed, someone else turned at the signal and like almost ran over a child, Do you have the same objection then? Because I actually don't have as much objection then. So but I want your intuition on that.
I see. So you think it's something like the severity of the situation is such that like a reminder to the citizen, like, don't do that. You might kill someone. That's not sufficient. It's within our powers, our collective powers or whatever that means, to actually get someone in there to stop you from doing it.
Yeah. And this is my point precisely, which is...
Well, okay, so I guess I don't know what I think about that. On the one hand, of course, I want to say something like, oh yeah, if the stakes are really that high and I'm going to run over a kid, we should make it such that police have access to that information that they stop someone from running over that kid. And now it's going to be this tough question to answer. I'm not really sure how to answer it about trade-offs between privacy and surveillance and that sort of an autonomy, that bucket of values and disvalues, and the bucket of values and disvalues related to, inadvertent or intentional killings.
Yes. Well, let me say this. I think that I think that we could agree on a set of conduct, right? Where the consequences are so severe that you would be okay with restrictions on autonomy, even preconditions on autonomy, to prevent those kinds of bad conduct. And then the question is, how big is that universe? But I think we could agree oh, look, if you're going to end up killing a child, then let's stop you from doing that however we can.
Yeah, I mean, look, if there was something like targeted, sniper data collection that only relates to those really high-stakes situations, then I'm more warm to the idea where I'm okay, they're just going to collect the data when it's super high stakes. I guess I'm skeptical that we're not going to be able to do that kind of sniper data collection, because the whole point is that you got to find the signal and the noise, but you got to collect a whole lot of noise. Otherwise, you can't, right. You're not going to know it. And so, yes, it'd be nice if we lived in a world where there was that sniper data collection for those, but there's not. And so they're going to have to, if it's going to be effective, collect way more data than they actually need in order to find those high-stakes situations. And so we're necessarily going to run into massive surveillance.
Yeah, so I think you're right that we can't do this with sniper data collection. We're going to have to use broad data collection. And my hope is that the bottleneck that we can introduce is only using it for sniper purposes, right? The purposes of stopping, severe conduct, and then just get rid of the rest of the criminal code. And I have a bunch of ways we could do that. But once you do that, I actually just don't have as many objections to the nanny, when oh my God, if my car is going to stop me from hurting somebody, running someone over, posing a significant risk to somebody else, that's fine, I'm just okay with that. And I'm actually okay with people reporting when I didn't do that, when I didn't follow the advice. Because look, again, we could eliminate punishment. And if what I did, right, if I was angry one day, I was completely reckless, and the car told me, don't run over that, don't turn here, you might run over a person. I did it anyways. I actually probably could use an intervention.
Right.
I could use cops coming over to me and say, hey, you can't do that, man. You almost killed somebody,
Sure. Yeah, I can see that. I guess a lot is going to hinge on how much confidence you have in the criminal justice system specifically, or the government generally, to only use that data when it's appropriate to do so in those high-stakes situations. I mean, some people just think the collection of the data is itself constitutes a violation of privacy. Just the having of it, even if nobody looks at it, just getting that data, no good. I'm not one of those people. I mean, I had this conversation with Carissa Valise where I think she's more on that side, where just the collection of that data is itself a violation of privacy. I'm more inclined to think, at least take a stipulated case where all that data is collected and goes into a vault, and only the people who are legitimately authorized to have access do in fact have access, and those who are not authorized do not have access. I think I think that's a fine world, or at least it's not necessarily a world that we really have to worry about bad surveillance or something along those lines. But I guess people have worries that we just don't have enough reason to trust criminal justice system, government, etc., to safeguard our data in the right kind of way, that it won't be abused. And so, that sort of lockbox doesn't exist. Although maybe, you tell me, maybe there are analogies in the law, like certain things not being admissible to court because they weren't collected in the right kind of way. Maybe is there something like that might inform when some data could or could not be used in a proactive measure?
So just a couple of things. I also don't share a strong intuition about whether the data collection in itself is a harm, per se.
Yeah.
What I would say there is people who have that intuition, I just I'm sort of agnostic on it or uninformed, I haven't thought about it enough. But I am like totally for those people who are fighting that battle. I assume they're going to lose, right? Like that if they do in fact lose, I think you're exactly right. I come at the criminal system with a great deal of skepticism. I do not trust, political actors to use the criminal code in the right way. But here's, I think, a big gap, which is that if all we have in mind is a Minority Report vision of an algorithmic criminal system, we are doomed, right? But if we can create a kind of vision that would hold our political actors' feet to the fire, tell them like, look, this is a plausible system when you have all this data, and this actually is freedom enhancing. This does not impose punishment. Do that. This is really a kind of political call. That's what I would say it is. It's certainly not trust in our criminal system, because I just don't have that. But it is like a sort of like vision that we can say, hey, why don't you do this instead?
So it's okay. So if I've got this right, if certain activists win to stop the collection of all that data, that's cool with you. That's all right.
Yeah, I mean, it's cool.
In a world in which they don't win, the idea is not to keep fighting that battle, but to fight a different battle, which is something like the responsible collection and use of that data by criminal justice system. And that's the fight.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I will say is that, like, look, I think it's a difficult empirical question whether limiting our collection of the data is really the way to go. Right? Because if we have a lot of data and we are able to reduce sentences, reduce criminal punishment and the like, as Peter Salib argues that we can do, maybe on net, that's the best way to go. And if that requires collection of the data, I'm like open, again, it's an empirical question. I'm open to that vision. Yeah. But you're right. Once we have, accepted that we're going to, then I think, in that situation, we need an articulation of how you could use that in the criminal code. That just won't be the fascist state, the nanny state, et cetera.
A lot of people in the sort of ethics space, privacy space are activists of a certain stripe where they're really pushing for like GDPR, but like an enforced version of GDPR. Right. And also by the state or for the state. And I guess that's one way you could fight that battle. But if you just think like, you fast forward 50 years from now with all the technology the way that it is, and you think that there's just going to be a sort of now with, halting of using all the way, there's no way. And so as a kind of, runner-up solution, we better really focus on the way in which to do this appropriately.
That's right.
And that's really good. That's a hard thing for hardcore privacy advocates, because for hardcore privacy advocates, it's like privacy or bust. It's the only thing that, privacy goes number one. Anything that would diminish our privacy, forget it. And you're like, actually, there's some really important things that could, one, you're going to lose your privacy battle. And two, there are other kinds of things that we can still safeguard. In fact, safeguard more by virtue of a decrease in privacy, but it's going to require political activism that gets really down to, like, I think, right, very particular laws about what can and cannot be done and what oversight there is for that.
I think that is right. Like, I do think if we're going to accept the algorithmic data state, then it is all going to be in the nitty gritty. And that is like sort of, the rest of this project saying kind of like, what are those precise principles on how to reform the criminal code in a way that is freedom enhancing and not a fascistic Minority Report kind of existence?
Do you have examples of those principles?
Yeah. I mean, one of them I've mentioned before, which is like, any kind of government intervention has to in the first blush, not duplicate punishment, right? Like the government interventions should not look like punishment insofar as as that's possible. So that's one. A second one is, let's get rid of all the protectual parts of the criminal code.
So what does that mean?
So like a lot of the code is used as a pretext for law enforcement to get into investigation, right? So like, I was mentioning before the vehicular code. A lot of that is so that officers can figure out what you're doing. Well, if we have these other methods of prediction, let's bring that down, right? Let's mitigate the inclusion of those kinds of criminal actions. Similar kind of thing is right now we have lots of offenses like attempt liability, conspiracy liability, solicitation liability. That is all about predicting the ultimate criminal wrongdoing, right? So they can charge you with a crime earlier because they don't want to risk you committing the full crime, right?
Right.
Well, if you're really good with data prediction and you know when I'm going to commit crimes, we can remove all of that, and you can then employ interventions that are non-punishment like, and instead, trying to stop me from doing this with a therapist, with a social worker, etc. So these are sort of principles that are like, look, if we get the benefits of all this prediction, we also have to decrease the impact and the footprint of the criminal code.
It's a short order. It seems like
simple. Easy. Right. Yeah.
All right. Well, Guha, this has been super interesting. Thank you so much. And, we'll have to come back. And I feel like I got to get you in a room with some other, a privacy fanatic. Fanatic is a bit strong. Activist. And got to hash it out.
I'd love it. This was fantastic. Thanks so much, Reed.
All right. Thanks, Guha.